Hello and welcome to the channel. Today I would like to compare a series of mid-19th century watches, and in particular I would like to pay a very close attention to these two pieces. However, I will be discussing a third piece here in comparison with these. Now, all of these watches, they are dating from the 1840s and 1850s period, so that we're right in the middle of the 19th century. And one of the key features we find here is this crowned architecture, how this comes up, and it's rather large. Indeed, this fell out of favor after the mid 19th century, so that they were less fat here, or much more streamlined. So we do have this old style architecture in the crown. So this watch here, now this is a very curious piece, and indeed I am very persuaded at this point that the maker of this watch was the same as the maker of this watch. And it is not only because of the overall architecture. There are other factors. However, I would like to open the watches and continue our discussion with these comparisons. So let us continue by opening the watches. A brief discussion on casework. Now, all of these watches share another factor in that these are not hunter cased. These are open-faced pocket watches, and so we don't have this extra layer on the front. However, you'll notice that the casework, there's a very beautiful guilloche that has been engraved. This design, very floral, rustic, and now this one, who is by a different maker, this is does not have this. Is just a plain silver case and a very basic design with very little application. However, you will see the great level of this design is just quite beautifully done. And we also see these are very similar manufacturing stylistics, that we do seem to see these same things applied. So that's another clue in our identification. But let us continue with the opening of the watches. Okay, now we're at the level of the cuvette, or the dust cover. Now, when we see, for example, in this watch, and this watch is signed Alphonse Montandon à Travers. This is a mountain maker from Traverse Valley and the village of Traverse. And so we know exactly who this individual is, but we will notice the way that this is fabricated, that this is in the general methodology for this period. However, this is clearly a different maker, and he has his own serialization, which fit with his other, we can compare it with his other watches, but we know who this individual is. So this can be put to the side. Now, let us review these two watches. We have very similar architecture, as you can see, and the placement of these signing locations, and indeed the entire format, is rather suggestive. This, in my mind, this does appear to come from the same hand. Now, whereas this piece is signed specifically Louis Montandon, Geneva, and we have actually the serial number here. This watch, the serial number is not written on the, it is not engraved on the back of this dust cover, this cuvette. We have this Geneva, and we have this Montandon signature. Now, at the beginning, and I will be providing close-ups of this so that you can compare, at the beginning of this, there is not per se an initial. However, there's a suggestion of an initial, and this suggestion is an L. And it is formed by these decorative swirls, and there is a small, almost teardrop shape, which could be also rendered as an S, so that this form of L, this rather almost a pound symbol, with this small raindrop, I do believe that this is L. Montandon or Louis Montandon, but a very decorative, very floral way of writing this. Now, if this is the case, then it is L. Montandon Geneva. It is not. If it is not the case, then it is simply Montandon Geneva. However, the watch serial numbers are extremely close in serialization, and I will be providing the serial number for this piece as well as this piece. However, these are tightly grouped. Their characteristics, and chronologically, they were made at very similar times. Once again, we're speaking of most likely after 1845, but certainly before the end of the 1850s. This is probably 1845 to 1855, but this watch is clearly an older piece, and I do believe that this was made by Louis Montandon, who was actually living in La Chaux-de-Fonds but was signing Geneva, and we find him in Devlin almanacs from this period. We know his location in La Chaux-de-Fonds. Now, Geneva would have been a very good selling point for any watchmaker. This immediately yelled quality to the customer, and this was sought after. But we also see the style of the engraver, that I would like to compare the engraving styles as well, that this most probably came from the same house of fabrication. The same specialists were used to do these various jobs. This is part of this établissage. So this was a watchmaker establishing watches, so to speak, and they would have various different specialists complete various specialized tasks. For example, engraving could be done by a subcontractor, and I do believe that this may be the same subcontractor, in this case the same engraver. So, but now I would like to go down to the next level and look at the actual movements themselves. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is that two of these watches, these two, are 50 millimeters in diameter, whereas this is 51. However, we can see, for example, in this watch, which was suspected older watch, and we do have some of these hints from the crown itself. However, these movement styles, these are so-called Lepine movements, and often there is Breguet. This would later be referred to as a Breguet style. However, this Swiss bar or Geneva bar, but also this is a Lepine. This is a caliber 4, and that we appear to have another caliber 4 with the Alphonse Montandon watch. Now this is already moving towards the caliber 5, and this is certainly an older piece. This is probably more towards the later 1850s, but this is plausibly in this late 1840s, mid to late 1840s period. But we do have these characteristics for these watches. Now, much is speculation, naturally. We have to take certain assumptions and use the data that we have at our when we're trying to determine who the maker is behind these pieces. But it is very plausible that we have, this Alphonse Montandon. This is clearly out of the picture. We know his dates from very clearly from Devlin almanacs. He stopped fabricating by 1865 because of a fire which destroyed his workshop and the 90% of the town of Travers. But these two pieces, I would wager that these are both by Louis Montandon, and he may not have fully come to his signature style, but at this time, this was probably when he was still in the early days of fabrication, and this was he was much more refined. And I should also mention that these are cylinder pieces. That we have cylinder escapements here, but I do believe there is a little bit of artistic license here, and now there are also Louis Montandon La Chaux de Fonds watches. There are at least 3, I believe, 2 or 3. So clearly that would have been him. However, I think in general he was signing, and that might have been for a very special clientele. However, in general, his watches and those for export, especially to the United States, would have had the Geneva signature. And when we compare these pieces, I think we're most, and this is also comes from the part suppliers, etc. That it is very clear that these are the same general characteristics of shared suppliers, and I do believe, therefore, that it is very proper or probable to consider that this piece and this piece were by the same maker, and that indeed Louis Montandon was very early on signing either L. Montandon or merely Montandon Geneva. However, this engraving feature before the M, I do believe this is hinting at the very ornate Baroque sort of pound sign L, and I can provide other examples of how this is formulated in this mid-19th century watch fabrication. Now, a brief mention about the actual signing. I wanted to take you very deep in to see up close these signatures. Now, we do have, obviously, in the later, more refined watch that is clearly dating from a later production, that we have the full name of the artisan, Louis Montandon and Geneva. This is clear. Now, in this previous watch, we have the following. Now, we do see that there is a very sort of decorative approach here, that this does appear to be sort of an LS replicated in this sort of very artistic fashion, that sometimes this artistic license was utilized to make a very beautiful signature. And we have seen these types of L's used. This is very in situ of the mid-19th century. We see this in the watch face signings as well. We have seen this utilized, the style of L. So this would have been a more archaic approach, clearly, because later they do switch to the more curvy L, as opposed to the pound sign. It sort of reverses the top reverses its sort of flip. But these are evolutions in these signatures. Yet this is the artisan's signing, and I just wanted to briefly mention this. Just sidestepping a bit to discuss the monograms of the casemaker involved in these watches. Now, with the watch which we see, which is suspected to be the earlier watch, and this has a serial number of 15759. Now, this is in comparison to the other watch, which is suspected later, and this is 17243. Therefore, these are very closely grouped. Now, there are very similar looking monograms underneath the lid of these watches. In the earlier watch, we do have below, next to the serial number of the fabricator, we have something which almost looks like a TH, but when held from various angles, it does appear more likely that this is an LM. Certainly, the second digit is much harder to read, whether it's an H or an M, but I do believe in this case it is an M, and it is in a circle, whereas in the other watch we have a very Baroque L, like almost like a pound sign, L and then M, very Baroque. And I do believe that these are both LM. And in the second watch, we do have this serial number 17243, again next to the monogram. So these are probably the same artisan, however, separated by perhaps as many as 5 to 10 years. And this would be reflected in the time difference in these watches from, say, the 1840s to the 1850s. Now, both of the dust covers do share very similar planning as far as we see that the engraving style is quite similar. Now, we do have in the one watch this cylinder escapement, 10 jewels hands, and in this case, the winding mechanism of this particular movement, or rather for the setting, the time setting hole, is so high that there would not have been room for a serial number to be placed here. So in its place, there is a scrolling, flowery motif. Then below we have the signature, and then very, very below we have Geneva. And the other watch follows the same nomenclature. We have cylinder escapement, 4 holes jeweled, hands, and then in this case we have a slightly different, more advanced Lépine mechanism, and there is room now as the time setting hole is higher for the serial number to be placed here, this 17243. Then we have the signature again. We have Louis Montandon and Geneva below. Geneva again in capitals. Now, one can play devil's advocate and say that the signatures of these watches are different, or the stylistics different. For example, the D in the one watch curves to the left, whereas in the earlier watch it does not. However, this could be down to perhaps a stylistic that either the engraver was making, or it could have been that the order of the watch engraving himself wished for a different style. But this is to be, these small differentiations are to be expected. But we do have these similar monograms in the case making. Now, in the earlier watch, there are actually 2 different serial numbers. One at the top, which is 11483, and then below 15759. Now, the one below with the monogram would have been most certainly in this case the fabricant who was putting his name on it. Now, earlier it was in the other case it was in a different location. Yet, once again, we are tasked with making a decision on this, whether this means anything or not. And in certain cases it could have been, but clearly the LM is Louis Montandon. And this is in the watch that is signed clearly Louis Montandon. However, these watches share so many of these very similar traits that this appears to be the same production from the same workshop, utilizing most likely the same subcontractors. And this is separated by 5 to 10 years. Now, when we see the serial numbers so close at 15759 and the 17243, this is probably about 5 years worth of watch sales difference. If they were selling several hundred, 300, 400 watches per year, even 200 to 400 watches per year, then this could be expected. That this clearly could be, and it is most probably this is the same production. So let us return to the watches themselves. this was a very interesting case for comparison. And since the also, I do want to stress that since the serial numbers are so tight, then clearly this is because uh, these were sold as this was the invoice number to the client. Indeed, the manufacturer could also use, when selling to this établisseur, the fabricant de horlogerie would provide a series that he would want movements produced between, say, 12,000 and 12,500, for example. And this would be his ledger or his accounting, his bookkeeping for sales that he would be selling based on those. And therefore, he had a running total for his production. And so they would stamp with numbers that fit his ledgers so that there would be clarity. But this was an interesting, a very interesting comparison of these watches. Sadly, this watch does have a cracked crystal. However, we do appear to have two Louis Montandon Geneva watches, and this is very probably Louis Auguste Montandon of La Chaux-de-Fonds, who was a businessman and also a watchmaker, and we do find him also in local government. So it is a very interesting case. I wanted to share the comparisons, and I thank you for your attention, your comments, feedback, and any other possibility to participate in the conversation. If you have watches of your own by this maker or similar makers, I would love to hear from you. But thank you for watching, and I wish you a nice weekend. Bye-bye.